So it's a pleasure to be here today with Tana Paddock, who is the co-founder of organization Unbound and has worked in community organizations with social initiatives for a number of years. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Tana. We know your bio, but I think everybody has a story beyond the bio. And I'm wondering if maybe you could share something about yourself that might give an indication about why you're so passionate about this space.
Yeah, so I started out in the social change world working as a community organizer, doing school reform in Baltimore City in the US. And what struck me from that experience, and not just my own experience working in that particular organization, but also being exposed to lots of other organizations during that time of doing that work, and then also following that with other jobs that I had had, mostly working with nonprofits, was this sense that that my job was to create resilient, strong communities out there. Yet my experience in the organization that I was working for, I didn't feel a sense of community. I didn't experience the things that I was trying to create out in the community that I was working in, and so that disconnect felt. It just didn't feel right, and it also it made me think, well, what if I was experiencing this on a daily basis? How would that affect my ability to create the kind of change I was looking to create? And I guess my hunch was that the more that I could experience it myself, the more that I would understand what I was trying to create at a visceral level, at an experiential level, and that then I would be able to I would be in a better position to help others create that as well, versus it being something that I learned at school. So I did community organizing was my my major. You know, so to learn community organizing in a classroom is obviously it's not the best way to go about it. But so I came in with lots of ideas of what I could do and should do. And wasn't necessarily connected to my own experience of my daily work life and how that would really affect my work. So,
great. I know that you're a big fan of a quote by Howard Thurman, a civil rights leader, who said, "Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go out and do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive." Why is that so important to you?
Yeah, for me that it's kind of connected to this idea that so often we remove ourselves from the social change that we're doing in the world. We think of ourselves as as these experts, or at least people that are at least trying to do their best to create change out there, and we forget that we're part of the world that we're trying to change. And so so I feel like the more that we can connect to what really fulfills us, and not just fulfills us, because it could be very difficult, but where you feel alive. Maybe it's through difficulty. It's not that we all need to be happy all the time in our work, but I think the paying constant attention to where you are feeling most engaged will directly affect your ability to engage others. So for me, that's always been something that I've been paying attention to. That said, I realize it's also contextual, because many people are not in that situation that they can even focus on themselves, because maybe they're in organizational contexts that don't focus on that. So that's part of my my passion, is to try to help social purpose organizations really start to value the people in the organizations, and that the more that you really feed their own connection, personal connection to the change that they're creating, and the more that you feed their own personal growth and the relationships between the people that are doing the work together, the more that's going to really feed the work.
Okay, so obviously this is how you came to want to create an organization to actually do this kind of work. So Organization Unbound is an attempt to reimagine the way we think about and engage in social change. What does that mean exactly, and how does that play out?
So for my vision would be a world in which you have every social purpose organization in the world would be creating change from the inside out, whether it be a hospital or a school, or so I define social purpose very broadly. So any organization, it could be a business that has social purpose at its core. So to me, that the fact that we don't work from the inside out is a huge barrier to our ability to create change. And so, so that is, in a way, we're trying to create a social change movement of social change organizations. Because I think that the way that we're going about social change work is completely wrong. It's completely, it's often up here from the head. It's not surprisingly. I mean, we come from an industrial model of organization and of approaching the world. So it's not surprising that we're using that model to try to create social change. But I think that model is the problem in the first place. And so if we don't start working differently inside our social change, social purpose organizations, it's going to be difficult for us to create change out in the world, because we're replicating the same patterns, the same social patterns that exist out there, that exist in our organizations, and our organizations are little microcosms of the world. And so we have to use those as training grounds and really dive into those. And I've heard so many times, because for years I was doing organizational development with nonprofits, and I always would hear people speak with such frustration about the internal dynamics of their organization as being dysfunctional and just the frustration was, if we could just fix this, or if we could just get that person out of the organization, then we would be able to do the real work. And I don't think the real work is within our organizations. It's to see that as separate is I think the problem. And so, if you can't create the kind of social patterns that you want to be in internally in a very small system like an organization, but you expect you can do that in the larger world, it doesn't make sense to me. And I think in a way it brings it brings sort of a very positive orientation to those problems, because those problems are the social change work. And so if you reframe it like that versus the problems that are getting in the way of the work, then I think that people's energy for working on those internal problems will shift, and they will see it as something that's core to their work versus tangential.
So if somebody wanted to reduce down the work that you're doing to generate that kind of same cohesion between the work out there and the work in there, would that be a psychological work or spiritual work or interpersonal work? Do you have an idea of what anchors or grounds your work?
I would say it's probably relational work. So, the concept that we work around is social change from the inside out, or creating organizations that are living expressions of their larger social purpose. So that's this beautiful ideal, right? It sounds wonderful, but then how do you actually do that on a day-to-day? What does that mean tomorrow when I go back to work? So the real work is, so we basically, when I say we, my partner Warren and other people that are starting to kind of join this movement, we were inspired by these organizations that we started to come across that were really living expressions of their larger social purpose missions. And so we started to dive into what practices, what day-to-day practices led them to become more expressive. And so what we found was it was very much in the moment-to-moment interactions amongst the people in the organization, including larger members. So it doesn't have not just staff, but volunteers and client members, depending on how involved, inclusive the organization is. So we just, we noticed that it was in the very small moments. It wasn't in some, separate retreat that they would do. It was that they started to work with each other in a way that really allowed the whole person to be present in the organization, in the work.
Now, would you attribute that to great leadership, somebody who had a framework to create this great co-working space, or was this intentional?
I think it's different in different organizations. One of the things that was challenging about digging into the actual practice of this is that in the organizations that were really beautiful examples of this expressive change, they weren't necessarily conscious of how that was happening. They would just talk about this magic. And they would compare it to other organizational experiences they had and talk about how different it was to anything they had ever experienced. And so we had to kind of really dig underneath to find out, what are you doing on a day? Like, what is leading to this? Because that's not, to just say it's magic is not helping any of the rest of us that are trying to kind of
go do magic.
Shift our organizations, So in that kind of digging a little deeper, what we noticed is both in our conversations with the people and our observations of organizations and in our own experiences. So we're constantly looking at our own organizational experiences as we go through them, is that people were working in a way that was deeply experiential. They were bringing, on a regular basis, they were surfacing their experiences of the work that they were doing, of their experiences of relating and working with each other, their experiences of just life. They weren't interacting as job descriptions. They were interacting as whole human beings. So they were bringing, all the kind of, the social patterns, they were bringing them into the workplace. They were part of the workplace. Say, as opposed to a very bureaucratic organization, which that's not welcome. That is not part of the work. We have this to do. We have these deadlines to meet. And so these places were working very experientially, and that seemed to be a major driver to the organization becoming more expressive. Because you can't, a job description a role cannot express a mission or a purpose. A person can, you have to feel it. So the more the people were kind of feeling more human, the more deeply they were connecting to that deep purpose of the mission. So there seemed to be actually there are many doorways though, I think. So we're kind of highlighting what we're seeing, but I think I feel like we've started the conversation and we've started the exploration, but this is just the beginning.
I'd like to deep dive in some of the practices, but before I get there, two things come to mind in terms of sort of what naysayers might say about this. One is, whoa, this is all a bit woo-woo and too touchy-feely and way too time-consuming, and how do we know it's working, and how can we keep it going, and this is personal stuff is interfering with the work. Right. So that would be the first critique. Do you have any comments on that? Yeah.
Okay. Which one? You just mentioned a bunch of them. What was the first one that you mentioned? I just had a bunch of
woo-woo.
Yeah. Okay. Woo-woo. Yeah. So that is a common response that this is kind of like navel gazing. And what does this have to do? What does your life circumstances have to do with what we need to do here on the ground? And I understand. I'm a very kind of pragmatic person, and I understand that that reaction from an emotional place. But what we've seen in practice is it doesn't become that if you do it right, because those people in the organization that would have that reaction, their surfacing that experience is part of the whole process of what we've come to call inscaping, the surfacing of the experience of the work. So that is part of, like, different people have different perspectives. But I would say also that the kind of the underlying experience that is happening in every organization is a reality, and we often don't pay attention to it. So to me, it would be not hard-headed to ignore that, because that is influencing the work tremendously on a day-to-day basis. So what's happening as we're relating, and we're not telling each other, but how we're experiencing each other through our work is having a tremendous impact on our ability to affect change. How I am thinking about myself through my work, my capacities, that's all affecting how how I'm able to do my work. What's going on in my life outside of work is having a huge, so I think it's naive to ignore that, and it's detrimental to ignore that. That said, the other concern that this would be taking too much time. So the organizations that seem to be deeply expressive, it's not about taking time out necessarily from the work to have, we're not doing group therapy, they seem to have developed kind of an internal muscle over time where this kind of surfacing experience becomes so integrated into how they work together. So in a way, because it's so normalized and it's so regular, you don't need that separate time. So for example, in a way, a typical organization would spend more time doing, end of the year evaluations, where people would keep all of their experience kind of pent up until that evaluation comes, and then it would pour out. This is how I've actually experienced. Where these organizations, not that they wouldn't also do that kind of evaluation, but because they got very used to sharing their experiences as they went along, there weren't many surprises at the end, when that time came. So in a way, it's more efficient. And if you start taking a lot of time doing things, surfacing that will help to balance, because no one really likes to do that. So one of the things that, this whole idea of really living out the change that you want to create in the world is not new. The feminist movement was really gifted at recognizing that we need to create organizations that really reflect the values that we want in society. But what often would happen is they would focus on structure and forms. So they would focus on, for example, so we want this to be a very participatory organization, so we're going to rotate executive directors. But not everyone wants to be an executive director. Right. Not everyone is good. So it was like this ideology that would inform how they work together. And an ideology is stuck. It doesn't move. It's an ideology, it's set. And so what would happen is people would become extremely frustrated, in the same sense, if, in terms of how they would run their meetings. Really participatory, everyone would, go around, you'd hear from everyone. But that's just a form of participation that maybe at first might feel really engaging and might really work at helping to surface people's experience. But after a while, it might kind of run its course. And then you've got people like, we got to do this again. It loses its effect. So these organizations that seem to that work in a really expressive way, the forms continue to change. They're alive, and so what they're really focused on is people's experience. So if a forum is no longer serving, if it's no longer leading to the goal of participation, then the forum will change. Whereas lots of organizations get stuck in the forum and they just keep the forum going. So we had this experience. Actually, a good example of this was when we were in India. We met with we were hosting dialogues around this work to kind of hear from people's different experiences. And one woman, she had worked for an organization. I think it was like an advocacy organization that had been started by I don't know how many people. It had been started by a couple of people who had had experiences working with other organizations that were working in a way that was really dysfunctional, and they were very frustrated, and so here they got this opportunity to create their own organization, and they were going to do it right this time. And so they worked really hard to create a flat organization, an organization that, you know, all had all the bells and whistles of participation. And then the next generation of people came in, you know, as the organization evolved, and their kind of assumption was, we built this perfect organization, you just need to come and experience it. But that's it doesn't work that way, because you can build the most beautiful ship, but once the people who originally built the ship move on, the new people coming in don't have a sense of ownership, even though it might be beautiful. So the engagement comes from the continually building it out of people's experiences. So as new people come in, even if it's just re-looking at that, and maybe they don't want things to change, but it's the fact that they don't have a sense of seeing themselves in the way that the organization works, then that tends to lead to resentment and a lack of a sense of ownership. Yeah, so I think that's very common. But to me, that was a very profound example, because the intention was so good. And it ended up this organization, because I asked her, I said, well, so what happened? You know, did it just die? And she said, no, it actually, the founders eventually recognized that this was a problem, and so they started to then involve people, and it did shift, and it became a really engaging place to work. Yeah.
Rehearse, okay. So before we go into sort of the toolbox of inscaping, I'd like to just explore one other reservation people might have about this work that requires people to be vulnerable in sharing their lived experiences with themselves and with their coworkers or the people with whom they're working on this social change. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So a piece of wisdom that I've held on to for a number of years comes from a man named Ronald Short, who wrote a book called Learning and Relationship. And what he said was that too often we expect a safe space to be created in order to be vulnerable, and that actually, in reality, that safe space is created by people becoming vulnerable. So once you, so if you want that safe space to be created, you kind of have to start. And through that, I mean, I've experienced it a number of times myself, that as soon as someone in the room puts themselves out there, then suddenly something shifts, and then that allows other people to feel safe. But someone has to start. Someone has to do that. And it's not something that can be managed, you know, where you're waiting for the boss or whatever. So that I think anyone can do it. And so I think, especially in a social purpose organization, our work is all about not waiting for someone else to do it. We're doing it. So this is a perfect example of social change being in our organizations. Is, you know, we are hard on other people in the world, whether it's around environmental or social issues, because they're not taking those chances, they're not taking those risks. Well, we can turn that on ourselves. So you have lots of social purpose organizations that have really toxic environments internally, because no one's taking that risk. Yet they're telling people in the world to take those risks who aren't comfortable. So we need to start being uncomfortable ourselves, and we need to see those, you know, those internal dynamics as little worlds that we want to change, and let's start trying to do that. Yeah, so I think it is true. It's a reality, and it's hard work, like social change work is hard work. Yeah.
So our MOOC, Social Learning for Social Impact, is going to involve groups that are already collaborating on some kind of social initiative, and many of the people who take this GROOC will be joining across the world, and they've never worked together. For both sets of groups, what could you offer as tools to create the dynamics for their work to manifest in a way that is productive? What is this inscaping work about?
Well, I think inscaping is one doorway. So right now, our understanding, and I'm sure it's going to be expanded and deepened as we continue to kind of dive into this area, but it seems like there's kind of three major doorways to an organization becoming more expressive. One is spending some time really looking at the deep why of your organization. So I think so often we get very caught up in our mandate and our mission and the what we're doing, rather than the how are we doing it and the why are we doing it. You know, the more intangible things. Partly because, you know, a big part is that funders don't pay attention to that stuff, right? And so then you start reacting to what funders want, and it's very concrete goals and objectives, and so we've found that is, you know, organizations often start very connected to that deep why, and then as time goes on, they gradually get further away from that, and so I think that any organization that has a social purpose can dig deep enough into that purpose where they get to the point that their purpose is one that serves everyone, the world. And so once you get to that point where you dig down deep enough, so for example, in an environmental organization that's focused on sustainability, if you really look at, well, what is sustainability? And what is, you know, what does it mean for human beings to live on this earth in a way that's sustainable? And it's all about interconnectedness, you know, so just that as an example. Are we, in the way that we go about our work, are we working with those same values internally, of the sense of that everyone in this organization is bringing something really valuable, and sometimes it's not clear why, you know, like the little frog in the rainforest or something, and sometimes they're really weird looking and they're weird and they act in a way that we don't understand, but they are, you know, so are we taking that kind of those principles of sustainability, and are we working in a way that's aligned with those, or just say well,
let me test whether I get this.
Yeah.
So homelessness, for example. So the social problem is you want to get people off the street, you want to give them houses, food to eat, jobs potentially. But when you dig deeper, is that really sort of about human dignity?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of.
Exactly. So it's not the food. I mean, obviously everyone needs to eat, but some people, we started the organization because some people really aren't getting enough to eat, right? So the people in the organization, they have enough to eat. So you'd have to dig down further. Yeah. So what is the fundamental purpose of the organization?
So that's the first door.
That's the first door.
Okay.
And it seems that the more that you dig down and you stay connected to that, the more that you naturally start embodying that, because the people in the organization, they feel it in a way that is kind of, it's an intangible way. It's not through just your objectives and the things that you can hold on to. So that seems to be one doorway. Another doorway, actually, so maybe just a quick, like very easy example. And it's easier for some organizations to dig down to the deep why than others. So for example, a school, it's about learning, right?
Yeah.
We all need learning.
Yeah.
That's how we grow and survive as human beings. So of course the teachers should be deeply connected to their own learning and to each other's learning. And so that's a very simple example of that. Or health, you know, hospitals. And what's interesting is both of these kinds of institutions are some of the most toxic places to work in. Schools, public schools, or schools in general, I should say, and say hospitals. Those are both, if you talk to teachers in public schools and you talk to like doctors and nurses, both of those environments are horribly lack learning and are unhealthy, right? So those are like stark examples. And so in a way, I kind of feel like it'd be great to start with those really obvious places, because it's so obvious to everyone, including patients, you know.
And governments meant to serve the people.
Exactly.
Right.
Governments, yeah. So a lot of our work seems to, we're not saying anything new. A lot of the feedback we get is you're putting language to something that I feel all the time, and I've never been able to, like, I don't talk about it, or people don't talk about it, but it's there. We feel it all the time. We feel this disconnect between the internal ways we're working and the larger goals. Yeah. So meaning is one. The second, which connects to meaning, is what we've started to refer to as the giving field. So this idea that traditionally social change, people that are doing social change work and organizations see their work in a very vectored way, where I am, I'm paid, or whether you're paid or not. You could be a volunteer, but you have this mission to deliver to someone else, or even to the earth. But that you're in service to something larger. And they don't necessarily see themselves receiving that mission themselves. So the example of a school, that the more that a school can really in its day-to-day life focus on how the teachers are learning and to what extent the teachers feel like they're growing and evolving as people, not just professional development, not just in terms of those concrete things, but as whole people, the more the place becomes really alive with its mission. Yeah. So that is another doorway, kind of really focusing on how am I receiving this mission? And maybe mission's not the best term, but how am I receiving this purpose? So the places that are deeply expressive that we've come across, it's just palpable. You just, when a teacher is just alive with their own learning, and I'm sure everyone has had this experience of the greatest, professors, those people are just alive with their own learning, and as a result, you feel alive with your own learning. So imagine a whole organization with a bunch of people that are feeling alive with their own learning. That is going to, there's like a radiant effect that has.
It's like a Google.
It radiates out. There's an intangible field that's created where everyone is receiving that purpose. And so there's an organization in Cape Town that we've recently come to get to know, which is this amazing place called Our Labs. And their focus is on community-driven tech solutions for low-income communities that are they're just really struggling with gang violence and with poverty and with drugs, and this place has their mission is to create a movement of hope worldwide, and their first focus is to make sure that the people that are at the core of that organization, that are working there every day, that they feel the sense of hope, and and they do, and this place is amazing. And as a result, it just oozes out of them, And so their own development is key to their work, and they're an incredible place that you talk to people there and they just start crying. Yeah, it's amazing.
As you're on the brink of doing.
Yeah.
Thinking about that.
Well, I am. That's why I do this work, because now you're gonna make. Because I've experienced these places, and they're just so different, and they're so alive, and I feel like part of the challenge of doing social change work is it gets really depressing when you're just focusing on the problems, and so to be in spaces that are really creating the change now, not waiting until the results in goodness knows how many years, but now. It gives you a sense that it's possible. And so then, like, I feel like we're on a sinking ship, that this world is, frankly. I mean, and I could get really depressed about it, and I have gotten really depressed. But I think that what keeps me going is being involved in organizations like this, because I can taste the future, like right now. Yeah.
Beautiful. The third door.
The third door, thank you.
Yeah.
So the third door would be inscaping. So, and so I've talked about this a little bit. So what we've discovered is, so this idea of working in a very experiential way and continuing to surface your experience as you go about your work, that there's two types of inscaping. There's inscaping about the work itself and how we as colleagues are experiencing the work, how we're experiencing our working relationship with each other, how we're experiencing the kind of larger goals of the organization, how we're experiencing what we just accomplished, say in a program that we were running. And then the other side would be, the other type of inscaping would be life inscaping. So how I'm experiencing, what my own struggles are as a person, what my own principles are, my values, my neighborhood, what I'm passionate about, what my talents are, that kind of thing. And so what we found is that some organizations are really good at one kind, or really, really good at work inscaping, or really good at life inscaping. And although both of those things are good, if you don't have both, then the organization becomes that you don't actually create a culture of social innovation. So to me, social innovation combines the social, which is the human experience, and the more kind of work-related creative thinking kind of thing. So work inscaping feeds a very creative culture where people are, if I don't agree with you, I feel completely free to say so. Or if I have this inspiring idea of where I want to see the organization go, I feel completely free to openly articulate that. So those places become very innovative, but they don't necessarily become very social. Even in a social purpose organization, you could have a very, so for example, this tech organization that I just mentioned in Cape Town, if it didn't have the life inscaping happening, and it just had work inscaping, it still probably would be very innovative in the kinds of work that it's doing. And of course it's social because that's its mission, but its ability to really affect the underlying social patterns of their community, from what we've seen, won't happen unless you start to bring really the whole human being into because the people that work in that organization are almost all formally involved in gangs, in drugs, in prostitution. So they know these issues deeply, and so they've all experienced this, and those institutions are living inside them. Of course, not all of us have had that kind of experience. So in a way, they're a particular organization, but it still does exist in us. So it's when those two come together that it seems like social innovation really happens. Yeah, and so I know there's different definitions of social innovation. So the definition that we kind of work from isn't just creating novel solutions. It's kind of Francis Wesley's definition of shifting the underlying dynamics of society. The flow of resources, the power dynamics, all of that. And so the more an organization works in a deeply expressive way, the more it's able to shift that. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask another question in another direction. The group that's been developing the content and the design of this MOOC has been collaborating for a number of months, and somewhere along the lines we realized that we ourselves are a social initiative. And we hear about successful social initiatives and how did you do it, and there's some kind of linear story to it apparently, but we know that's not true. Now, Organization Unbound is also a social initiative. I wonder if you'd like to tell us the real story on how you went from an idea to where you are today.
Yeah, well, the idea was born between my partner and myself, sitting on a bench in Sweden, where we went on this trip that seemed to be a very odd trip, and we weren't quite sure why we were there and what we were getting out of it. And so we were kind of out of our element, and so I guess we started talking about our dreams. I don't know, because we were in this weird space and we weren't sure why we were there. And so it came, like literally came from us talking on a bench in Sweden, but it really came from us having experienced working in organizations where there was a very big misalignment between the internal workings of the organizations and their larger social missions. So we were feeling it internally ourselves and feeling disturbed by it. So it came from our own personal experience, and it continues to be driven by that. Now it's less driven by a feeling of disturbance and more a feeling after having come across organizations that were working in a different way. It's now coming from a place of inspiration and feeling like, wow, what if all social purpose organizations felt like this? Mm-hmm. Imagine the kind of impact, the kind of social innovation that could happen in this world. Yeah. So, so it developed. So I think one of the challenges that social purpose organizations have, particularly nonprofits, or actually all, is that the law requires organizations to create structures that are often not what the people who want to do the initiatives want. So, for example, you have to, if you want to receive any kind of funding through formal channels, you have to incorporate, mm-hmm. which then requires certain things. You have to have a board, which then requires certain things, and particularly having a board that suddenly you just create a board. You just have to find people to sit on your board, which is not an organic, emergent way of creating an organization. So it's something that I've never come across a nonprofit that actually well, that's not true. It's rare that you come across a nonprofit where the dynamic between the board and the staff is a healthy one. And I think that fundamentally comes from the fact that when the organization was created, they didn't necessarily want that board, but they had to have the board. So when you're creating an organization out of what you should do versus what feels right, mm-hmm. then that's an issue. So one of the things we were really conscious about is wanting to push those boundaries and experiment. So we consciously decided we did not want to incorporate. We just wanted to do the work. We don't want to run an organization. So for also the type, when I say organization, we didn't want to run a formally structured organization.
Entity. Yeah.
A legal organization. So obviously this comes with challenges around funding, but we also, so there was that, and we also didn't want to become consultants, because how people relate to you is very different. How organizations relate to you, suddenly, what do you want? What are we going to get out of this? I don't know. And what we really wanted to be in a learning relationship with social change organizations, not a consulting relationship, and we didn't want to run, this kind of formal organization ourselves. So we've stayed away from that, and it's been great, because I think it's allowed us to be in conversation with organizations in a way that is very open, and it's just, we want to learn with you. That's all. Mm-hmm. And so I've been very happy with that. It's been a very liberating experience. Mm-hmm. I don't have any deliverables. It's just a space of learning that I'm interested in. So that's been really interesting, and we'll see what happens. I mean, I think there's an assumption that there is a linear process that, okay, you have an idea, then you create an organization, and then, you incorporate, and that's success. And I think that often, and again, I don't want to be trapped by this form. For some organizations, it might be perfect. Having a board and doing all of the kind of conventional things that you would do to create a social change organization works fine. But to assume that that is what's going to make you successful, I think is not right. And so being this amorphous thing, mm-hmm. yeah, I don't know where it's going to go. Mm-hmm. We're just kind of letting it. We're on a ride, and I think our vision is to kind of support and to catalyze a community of practice that's global, but that we don't necessarily own. Mm-hmm. And it could be housed in many places, and so it's been a lot of connecting and we've just been able to work in a way and develop relationships that I don't think would have been possible when you have job descriptions and you have all these formal things that have to happen. And I think that social purpose work has been so professionalized, which on one hand is great because people can get paid to do really meaningful work, but on the other hand, the community and community work is kind of gone because we've squashed the humaneness out of it through our approach to building organizations. So, so for example, we had someone contact us a couple of years ago that asked if he could come and live with us for a few months to work on Organization Unbound, because he felt that looking back at all the things that that has influenced his thinking, he felt that this was one of the most powerful things, that it really spoke to him and really seemed to put a name to what he had experienced in his work. And so we thought, okay, come live with us. And we did some amazing work, and actually his influence has been phenomenal and has really affected the way that our trajectory. Yeah. So that could never, I don't think that would have ever happened, in a normal organization. And it continues to be like that, where people are, and it was volunteer, I mean, and so people are not seeing it as like a potential employment. It's like we're getting people who just feel deeply passionate about what we're doing, and it's not in a way tainted. And myself, I mean, we've decided to self-fund me. So I'm not getting paid. And I'm not saying this is for all organizations, but we're in a particular financial situation that we can make that choice. But I think that lots of people are in that situation, but they're not choosing that, but they could. So maybe putting it out as an option that, yeah,
Great.
that there are different ways to build organization.
Yeah, you'll tell me and I'll ask her, okay? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, poor, I just realized Carlos left. He had a question to ask, but.
Okay. He'll be back.
Okay.
My question is, at what age?
Hi, Henry.
At what age did you know you wanted to create social change? And is it too late for those who come at it later?
Okay. So I'll go back to a more personal question for you, Tana. At what age did you have a sense that you wanted to work within the domain of social change? And can anyone at any stage of life enter this space?
That's a really hard question. And it's a little bit of a complicated one because I had a very unique upbringing. So at an early age, how old was I? 8? My parents moved me and the whole family to a religious commune / cult, depending on your perspective. And so I grew up in this very communal environment where the kids weren't just stuck off in a school somewhere. We were an integral part of building the community. So I worked on a farm, I worked in a carpentry shop at 8, 9, 10 years old. The learning was very integrated into life. And so that community experience when I was about 12 fell apart, like many of these utopian experiments do. And I this is all in retrospect of how I ended up doing what I was doing. But I think that initial experience of community stayed with me so strongly that when I left, I was just seeking that again. And although there were aspects of that experience that were not good, my experience of it was tremendously positive. And so, where did I leave off?
So even though parts of it were not so good, yours was particularly extraordinary. Yeah.
Right. So in retrospect, that is where my desire for creating community that's my driving force, is creating community, because I think I think relationships, the quality of our relationships, determine what we create in the world. And so from the time that we're, in school, for me, school is like, it's our first experience of organization, right? And it's not a good one for most people. And that the way that the culture of schools, it determines what kind of organizations we create when we get out of those and start creating our own organizations. So the fact that I had a very different experience of learning, and then left that and then went into a typical public school in the US, which was just a traumatic experience. Suddenly I was relating to adults, and it was very authoritarian. It was the school had no windows because they were designed that way because they didn't want kids to be distracted by nature. So things like that, and so although I had this kind of yearning, it's not, schools don't really teach you that there's a bunch of people in the world that you can actually do social change work. You're pretty much told that there's business and there's government. So I didn't really, like many people, I fell into the kind of nonprofit sector. And obviously at this point, things have evolved and those sectors are blurring, the lines are blurring between those sectors. But back then, they weren't. They were pretty hard and fast. And so I ended up doing a sociology degree because I was interested, particularly having been in this other communal environment. I felt kind of like, the best sociologists are ones that kind of see, they're from a marginal position. So I was definitely seeing the world that I was in from this very marginal position, and like, it felt alien to me. So at an early age, I was kind of analyzing the social dynamics around me and wondering why are they the way they are. And then I ended up going on and doing community organizing work.
So what about people at any age?
Yeah, well, I think that more and more the possibility at any age to go into this work is expanding. Partly because the world is changing and there is more freedom to, no matter what environment you're in, the consciousness around the fact that we are, as a human race, we are destroying society and we're destroying ourselves. That consciousness has been raised over, say, the last, 15 years. And so more and more businesses, are now kind of starting to integrate that into their working. So I think there's more space than there ever was, and I think there will continue to be more space for people to, even in their own, without having to maybe even switch careers, they can start to look around where they are to say, okay, how can I bring a lens that has more of a social justice orientation, environmental orientation? Yeah, so I think, and then also, as they say, people now have 5 careers or whatever. I think we can change. There's just more flexibility in the world. The world's more fluid. So I think there's more opportunity to that. And hopefully, and business schools and schools are changing and they're starting to bring that lens in more and more. And so I think in a way before, a big barrier was people didn't know there was a possibility to do anything different. And I hear that a lot. And they often thought, even the nonprofit sector, and the number of people that thought I am working I am not getting paid now, but the kind of assumption that if you're in the nonprofit sector that you're not getting paid, like people didn't realize that you could actually have a job, because it was never mentioned in school that was even an option.
Right. Yeah.
So that's shifting.
Okay. Carla? So we anticipate with this MOOC that we're going to draw from a variety of different age groups and people working on different social initiatives. But many of them will have not worked together, and we assume that most of them will be youth in their 20s. If they're starting to collaborate on a social initiative together as a result of taking this MOOC, is there any insight or offering you can provide based on your experience?
Yeah, I would say listen to your intuition. That I think part of why organizations, social purpose organizations are working the way that they're working is because people are working from what they think they should be doing rather than what they actually feel is right and that works for them. And so, and I think that can be a trap that young people fall into is, well, what should I be doing? What is convention? What, I'm being looked at by the world, by people that are older than me, that have more experience. But those people haven't actually succeeded in creating really dynamic social purpose organizations that are deeply expressive and embodying their missions. So they're in a way paving the road. And I have found myself gravitating to younger people for that reason. That said, in a way, the people that seem to gravitate to us are often people that have had experience in other organizations and they know what the other more mechanical, mechanistic way of working feels like, and they don't want that. So in some ways, I find it difficult to talk to younger people that don't have that kind of experience because they don't realize how most organizations function. And when you don't have that experience, you don't have anything to compare it to. But on the other end, if they can really, from the very beginning, develop a muscle of really working from their own experience, then they're seeding an organizational culture that will be very resilient. And it doesn't necessarily mean the organization is going to live forever. I think one of the problems that being so focused on organizational survival brings is that you become more attached to the survival of the organization than the actual work of change. And so, I think that happens a lot. And so I think organizational death is good, and we need to embrace that a little bit more, because often that death is like compost, and people go elsewhere and they fertilize, and that people need to actually get, sometimes, there's this assumption that an organization is not successful if it dies, but I think that's misleading. And in some cases it might be true, but it's not always true. And so I think, if we think about organizations, social purpose organizations, in a more fluid way, that it's really the relationships that are being developed. Those are what's going to drive real change over time. No matter if the organization dies tomorrow, then it dies. You still have those really strong relational connections that can continue to feed whatever movements and kind of cross-pollinate and so I would suggest to them, don't, because it's easy especially when you're a founder, to get very attached to this thing that you're building, and you become more attached to that thing than the experience that you're trying to create.
And the social learning.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that I think we often forget that social change, that our goal in social change is to create a different experience of the world. So it would make sense for us to focus on experience, because that's what we're trying to create. We're not trying to, the forms don't matter in the end, right? It's the experience. I mean, we can create all kinds of forms that might, at this point, address whatever issue that we're trying to address, but that might change over time. So we need to constantly be connected to experience. So that's another example of the more that we can do that internally, the more we'll be able to do that externally in our work. Because a lot of reasons that things don't, we talk about trying to scale social change initiatives, and a big reason for the difficulty in scaling is because people scale forms, and the people that are then receiving those forms try to replicate it, and it doesn't work because the people on the ground it's not growing out of their lived experience. So, yeah.
It's been such a pleasure to chat with you, Tana. Thank you so much for your contribution to this MOOC.
You're welcome. My pleasure.